Ladies and gentlemen, this is TVP World. I'm your host Benjamin Lee, and welcome aboard the Eastern Express. Now, when most people think about NATO's front line, they think usually about Poland and the Baltic states, places where Russian drones, spies, and disinformation campaigns collide daily with Western defenses. But far to the north, in the Arctic, lies a remote archipelago that could become one of the most important tests of NATO's readiness, Svalbard. Now, it may not look like much more than glaciers, polar bears, and a small research community, but Moscow sees much more, and what Russia sees, it acts upon. So, without further ado, let's get into this subject and find out how Russia is acting. Here's a look at our latest report.
A Russian state-owned company has stirred controversy on Norway's Svalbard archipelago by driving around a vehicle resembling a police car in Barentsburg, the Russian settlement. The car mimics law enforcement markings, despite Norway's criminal code banning foreign symbols that could be mistaken for official authority. Norwegian MPs condemned the situation, calling for the car to be repainted or removed. They described it as a deliberate provocation and urged close monitoring. The Norwegian Minister of Justice confirmed that all vehicles on Svalbard must comply with Norwegian regulations regardless of ownership. Some voices suggest Archipelago is testing the boundaries of Norwegian law, staging a grey zone scenario to provoke a response. While no laws may have been directly broken, the incident underscores ongoing tensions over the interpretation of the 1920s Svalbard Treaty, which allows economic activity by signatory nations under Norwegian sovereignty.
And now, let's zone in on the east-planning portion of our show. The Svalbard Treaty, signed on February 9th of 1920 in Paris, granted Norway sovereignty over the Svalbard archipelago while ensuring equal economic access for all signatories. The treaty was established to regulate the legal status of the Arctic territory, which was then a sparsely populated region rich in natural resources.
The Svalbard Treaty allows all signatory nations equal rights to engage in commercial activities such as mining and fishing on the archipelago and in its territorial waters, while prohibiting military use. Today, only Norway and Russia actively mine in Svalbard, exploiting its coal reserves. Norway operates the majority of mining activities, while Russia maintains a presence through its state-owned company, Archipelago, in Barentsburg. Fishing disputes have also marked the treaty's history, particularly between Norway and the Soviet Union. Since the 1970s, Norway has enforced a 200 nautical mile fisheries protection zone around Svalbard, claiming exclusive rights to regulate fishing. Russia, along with some other signatories, has contested this, arguing that the treaty's equal access provisions extend to the surrounding waters.
And now, let's take a look at the issue in greater detail. Just this month, Russia escalated its provocations in the region, bringing in vehicles designed to look like Russian police cars, even though Norway's criminal code explicitly forbids foreign authorities from operating there. Moscow also announced it would double its flights to Svalbard next year, despite having cut international flights almost everywhere else since the start of this full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Now, why does this matter? Because under the terms of a 1920 treaty, Russia and more than 40 other countries have right to economic and research activities in Svalbard. Norway has ownership of the island, but its ability to enforce its own rules is limited. Moscow knows this, and so it uses the gray areas to stage provocations, creating incidents that force Norway into a no-win scenario. If Oslo responds strongly, the Kremlin cries Russophobia. If Oslo remains restrained, Russia quietly pockets another concession. We've seen this pattern before. It is the logic of salami slicing, of taking small steps that individually do not justify an armed response, but cumulatively erode sovereignty and shift the balance of control. At the same time, Russia has been testing NATO with drone incursions into so many countries in recent weeks that it is hard to keep count. Their purpose is deadly serious: to probe NATO's readiness and to highlight divisions within the alliance about how to respond. They are designed to make Western public ask a dangerous question: would NATO really invoke Article 5 if Russian drones or missiles kill civilians in a member state? Moscow is not preparing to launch tanks into Norway or Romania tomorrow, but Vladimir Putin is seeking to undermine NATO's cohesion, weaken its mutual defense commitments, and erode the West's will to continue supporting Ukraine. The Arctic matters more here than many realize. Control over Svalbard and the surrounding seas would give Russia a stronger position in the North Atlantic, including routes for submarines. In a conflict scenario, this would make it easier for Moscow to threaten Western shipping lanes and NATO's transatlantic lifeline. The presence of China is another signal. Last year, Russia announced that Chinese researchers would expand their activities on Svalbard, linking Beijing more directly to Moscow's Arctic agenda. It's one more piece of the puzzle showing that Russia is not acting in isolation, but as a part of a broader geopolitical alignment. For most people in Europe or North America, Svalbard may remain a blank spot on a map, a place known only for icebergs and research stations. But for Putin, it is a tool. And for NATO, it is a test. The West cannot afford to fail. And now, here to share more light on the issue is Paul Goebel, Distinguished Senior Fellow at the Jamestown Foundation. Hello, sir, and welcome to Eastern Express.
Thank you for having me.
So I'm pretty curious, because in your recent article, you actually argued that the Russian drone incursion into Poland and Romania are somehow connected to its action in Svalbard. Can you explain how these kind of seemingly different theaters are part of the same broader Russian strategy?
Russia wants to break NATO. It wants to break the relationship between the United States and Western Europe and Eastern Europe. It wants to keep the West unbalanced, and therefore moves in one direction in this broader theater are always connected with moves elsewhere. Moscow's focus on Svalbard is one of those ways that Moscow can do that, because Svalbard exists under an international treaty from 1920 that restricts the military presence there, even of Norwegian forces, which Svalbard is part of Norway, and therefore a Russian move there or in some other places where there are restrictions on military presence could have the effect of dividing the West, of convincing people that we have to accept what Russia is doing, and that will create a new fact on the ground that Moscow will exploit elsewhere in this broader theater.
And most people outside of Norway sees like Svalbard as something more symbolic, or frankly don't think of it much at all. Can you help us understand from a strategic standpoint, how does this archipelago affect NATO's ability to secure the North Atlantic and protect transatlantic supply lines?
Well, Svalbard is between Greenland and the Scandinavian countries. It sits on top of the main route out of Russian submarines. It's where the monitoring of the movements of Russian ships takes place. It's important as a potential landing site and transit zone, just like Iceland, between North America and Europe. If Svalbard were to fall under Russian influence, it would be far more difficult both to monitor and control the use of Russian submarines in the North Atlantic, and also to ensure that if push came to shove, the United States would be able to send all the forces it would need to in that situation to Europe to resist Russian aggression.
And Russia seems to be relatively good at conducting these sort of called gray zone provocations, kind of stopping just short of outright aggression while still being relatively effective in kind of affecting national sovereignty and kind of encroaching on different nations. How can we use Svalbard as kind of an example to illustrate that, and what risk does it pose to Norway?
Well, there is a risk that Moscow is very good at doing that. It exploits Western desire not to go to war, not to have to fight. It resists, it exploits the Western view that in 1991 history ended, that there would be peace for all time, that we wouldn't have to defend ourselves in the same way as we did before, and that therefore if there's a place where Russians have some rights, the fact that they're pushing at the edges of those rights isn't something that we should be alarmed by. At least that's the message that Moscow is trying to deliver. The problem with that, of course, is that each new Russian advance, testing of the waters, testing of the limits, creates facts on the ground that then, with time, come to be accepted by those who say, this isn't a place to fight. That was the argument made not to resist Russian aggression in Georgia in 2008, Russian aggression in Ukraine in 2014, and then Russian aggression in 2022. We see what happens is that each time the West decides that, this is something which we don't have to resist actively, Moscow moves just one more step. What makes Svalbard so threatening is that it is, in fact, part of the NATO alliance. It is part of Norwegian sovereignty. And if Moscow is able to get people to accept the idea that it should be able to do things unilaterally in Svalbard, having its own forces there, police forces to begin with, military forces likely in the future, then it will become one more place where the West will have shown that it's not willing to stand up to Moscow, and that will open the door to aggression elsewhere. That's why it's so important that countries like Poland, like the East Europeans, pay attention to Russian probes in the north, because they're not about those places alone. Ukraine is not about Ukraine alone as far as the Russians are concerned. It is about destroying the Western alliance. It is about opening the way to Russian expansion far beyond even the Soviet borders. And therefore, while Svalbard may be a place few have heard of, it may be a place that seems not terribly important in and of itself. In fact, it is the testing site right now for how far Moscow will be allowed to go before a conclusion will be reached that this cannot be allowed to go any further. The fact that the West is divided over what to do about Ukraine, even, and the object of direct Russian military intervention, shows the extent to which Moscow can count on other places, the West remaining divided. It should be a warning sign that those kind of divisions must end, and that it's necessary to stand up to Russia in Svalbard, as well as other places, or we will see more and more of it. That's what I had in mind in what I wrote, and it is, I think, a very important point of view that needs to be taken into consideration rather than dismissed in the hopes that, it won't matter that much. That's the kind of argument that's been made again and again with respect to Putin's aggressiveness, and in the past to other dictators' aggressiveness. People ask who would die for Danzig, and then they ask who would die for Narva, and now people will say who would die for Svalbard. Well, the problem with that argument is that it allows a salami tactics by Russia to take more and more, and the longer this goes on, the more there will be people who will say, now we're not in a position to defend this or that, and consequently, we must accept what Moscow wants.
You also noted that Moscow is very good at being careful when it comes to sticking to the letter of the 1920 treaty, even though at the same time really stretching the spirit of it. What kind of loopholes or ambiguities has Russia or Moscow been exploiting?
Well, the Svalbard Treaty of 1920, which was one of the great successes of the League of Nations, specified that the Svalbard archipelago was part of Norway. It also specified that other countries signatory to that treaty, of which Russia is one, have the right to engage in economic activity there. They do not have the right to engage in military activity. But what we've seen is Russia constantly testing that limit, while the coal mines that the Soviets developed have closed down, and although they may reopen, what we're seeing are things like a unilateral act by the Russian companies there to bring in Russian police forces, to have military-style cars patrol, to celebrate the Russian anniversary of the end of World War II in Europe, and to do so with Soviet and Russian music and other things. And this is a way of saying we can act beyond what is clearly the letter of the Svalbard Accord, and that we will keep pushing until we're stopped. And so far, there's been a lot of concern in Norway about this. There's been concern in Scandinavia. There's been relatively little concern about this in the West generally. And I think that's simply a result of the fact that the West doesn't really want to have a confrontation with Russia, and therefore tries to play down things, which is exactly what the Russians hope for, and which leads to a situation where we see salami tactic by salami tactic, Russians taking more and more of the what had been viewed as clearly NATO territory under their greater influence and hope, from their point of view, ultimately occupation.
Right, and some of the worry is not just Russia as well, right? One of the things I find interesting in what you wrote is also about the increased presence of Chinese researchers in the area as well. How much of it is really just scientific cooperation between Russia and China, and how much of it do you think is a more geopolitical signaling of this Moscow-Beijing alliance in the Arctic?
Well, if you looked at this abstractly outside of time, it's a purely scientific action. If you look at it in terms of when this was announced, how it was announced, and what is being done, it's a geopolitical challenge. Moscow and Beijing see the area around Svalbard as the western gates to the Northern Sea route, which Russia and China both want to control. In the short term, Chinese support for Russia in Svalbard this way helps Russia diplomatically, because it will lead some in the West to say, well, we don't want to do anything tough about what the Russians are doing in Svalbard because it would get us in conflict with China. That is what Moscow is counting on by involving the Chinese. Longer term, of course, it contains within it a threat to Moscow itself. The Chinese have made it very clear over the years that they see themselves as the dominant player in the Northern Sea route area, and that Russia isn't able to build enough ships. It isn't able to even now to put enough icebreakers at sea. Until Putin invaded Ukraine, Russia was launching about one icebreaker a year. In the last 3 years, it has launched only one. It no longer can produce enough ice-capable ships to make the transit of the Northern Sea route, and so is putting non-ice-capable ships on that route, which of course raises the prospect that there will be a terrible gas or oil leak or some other disaster in the north. The Chinese are ready to exploit that. They're building icebreakers and ice-capable ships very, very rapidly. And so in the short term, what China is doing very much helps Moscow with its goals. In the longer term, as the Russians undoubtedly recognize, China is quite prepared to push Russia aside and become the paramount power in this region as well. So standing up to the Russians now is ultimately standing up to China and China's aspirations to be the next superpower.
Right, so this very kind of small area actually has a lot going on for it as well, and it's definitely not something that should be overlooked. Thank you so much for your input and insight. Really appreciate it, and thanks for being with us on Eastern Express.
Thank you.
And now we're moving on to the Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you don't want to miss. Russia has failed to reclaim its seat on the United Nations Aviation Council, facing strong resistance from the European Union over its actions in Ukraine. The vote marks another diplomatic setback for Moscow amid growing international condemnation.
In a tense vote held on September 27th, Russia was unable to secure enough support to rejoin the International Civil Aviation Organization's Governing Council. The defeat follows its 2022 expulsion, triggered by the illegal seizure of foreign-leased aircraft during the invasion of Ukraine. Moscow immediately demanded a repeat vote, but EU officials stood firm. Russia's exclusion is not only symbolic, it denies the country influence over global aviation standards despite controlling the world's largest airspace. A return would have helped Moscow legitimize its controversial re-registration of hundreds of stranded aircraft. The ICAO has also held Russia responsible for the 2014 downing of Malaysia Airlines flight MH17, which killed 298 people.
Russia is restricting Red Cross access to Ukrainian prisoners of war, showing only healthy detainees during stage inspections. Independent experts say the practice may amount to war crimes.
An international expert mission has revealed that Russian authorities are systematically obstructing the International Committee of the Red Cross from inspecting Ukrainian prisoners of war. While some visits occur, they are tightly controlled, with inspectors shown only detainees in relatively good condition. Sick and tortured prisoners are hidden from view. According to UN and international reports, up to 95% of Ukrainian POWs in Russian custody report experiencing torture or ill treatment. Methods include beatings, electric shocks, mock executions, forced confessions, and sexual violence. The expert mission, activated under the OSCE's Moscow mechanism, concluded that Russia's treatment of POWs may constitute war crimes and, in some cases, crimes against humanity.
Russia and Belarus have regained full Paralympic rights, opening the door to national flag participation at the 2026 Winter Games. Ukraine calls the move a betrayal of Olympic values.
The International Paralympic Committee has lifted its partial suspension of Russia and Belarus, restoring their full membership rights and paving the way for athletes to compete under national flags at the 2026 Milan-Cortina Winter Paralympics. The decision made at the IPC General Assembly in Seoul comes despite ongoing war and occupation in Ukraine. While the IPC's ruling restores formal privileges, actual participation remains subject to international federations overseeing 6 winter sports. These bodies have yet to lift bans on Russian and Belarusian athletes, even under neutral status.
And that's all on this episode of Eastern Express. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.